Croeso. Hello and welcome to St Davids Cathedral in Pembrokeshire. We find ourselves standing outside this magnificent cathedral today, which was built between the years 1180 to 1220. But what is the story of the man who it is named after? We know very few hard facts about David, as he lived 1500 years ago. During this time, people in Wales passed on their histories and stories by speaking, by poetry of the bards and by singing. Repetition was often used to help people remember and repeat the stories correctly. This was how the stories and miracles of St David's life were passed on. By the 11th and especially the 12th century, when the Normans were extending their rule into Wales, there was seen to be a need to write down Welsh history so that others could not forget about it so easily. Several people wrote about the life of St David at the time, and the accounts are so similar as to suggest they are accurate. One of the best known is by the son of Bishop Sullivan of St David's, a man named Rygavach. Rygavach was a learned scholar. He gained a reputation amongst his peers as a foremost scholar and teacher, which lasted for centuries after his death. In fact, he was so widely regarded throughout the country that the authoritative medieval Welsh annals named the Brit y Tywysogion, or Chronicles of Princes, described him as a doethaf y doethon y Britanniate, one of the most learned of the learned men of the Britons. Rygavach's most notable work was the oldest surviving biography of Saint David, which he wrote around 1090. 500 years after David's death. Named the Vita Sancti Davidis Episcopi, it appears in a single complete copy in a 12th century manuscript. Rygavach wrote the original in Latin, but by the later medieval period, it had also been translated and adapted into a Middle Welsh version known as the Llanddewi. Medieval lives of saints were not like biographies, but stories written to inspire by example, sometimes drawing on the lives of other saints and even Jesus himself. Rygavach refers to David as an archbishop, perhaps because he wanted to make St David's the seat of an archbishop, equal to Canterbury and York. He also drew on Celtic history and saints' legends to weave a powerful story of great holiness. To find the place where David's story begins, we must take a short walk to a place known as Capel Non or St Non's. Almost 2,000 years ago, the Prince of Powys, a young man named Sant, also known as Sand or Sanctus, was visited by an angel. This spirit told him that for 30 years he should keep a piece of land ready for his future son. That piece of land is where we find ourselves stood today. In fact, this same angel is said to have visited St Patrick. It is thought that while travelling through southwestern Wales, St Patrick decided it would be a good place to settle down and spread the word of God among locals. his plans were scuppered by a visiting angel who told him that God had already reserved the region for another man who would not be born for 30 years. St. Patrick didn't take the news well, indignantly demanding to know, "Why hath the Lord despised his servant who has served him from his infancy with fear and love? Why hath he chosen another not yet born?" Fortunately, he calmed down when the angel told him that he would be the Apostle of Ireland, and he gladly left the sacred spot for Holy David and sailed for Ireland. 30 years after Sant was visited by the angel, he fell in love with a woman called Non, who was the daughter of a local chieftain. When she became pregnant, it is said that a local pagan ruler learned of the pregnancy and feared the power that the unborn child might have in the future. He plotted to kill the baby as soon as it was born. On the day of his birth, somewhere around the year 500 AD, a ferocious storm raged. Lashing rain and hailstones caused great floods. Thunder roared, and a vast display of lightning made it impossible for most to travel in the region. This scuppered the plans of the pagan ruler. In a stone circle on top of the cliffs, Non went into labour. All around her the storm intensified, but within the circle all was calm, and the sun shone with so serene a light that it glistened and was visible as though God had brought it in front of the clouds. It is said that due to the pain of labour, she gripped the rock so hard that she left finger marks in it, and it split in two in sympathy to protect her. At the place now known as Capel Non or St Non's, she gave birth to a little boy. A spring of pure, clear water sprang up to mark the place of his birth. Non named her baby Dewi. This little boy grew up to become Saint David, the patron saint of Wales. Today, alongside the original chapel of St Non, is the newer chapel built in 1934 by Cecil Morgan Griffiths, which pays tribute to her. Another modern feature of St David's is the stone circle in the middle of the city, which pays tribute to the patron's birth. As a young boy, David grew up to become a priest and was educated at the monastery of Henfynyw, which is where we head next. The Victorian-era church you see behind me at Henfynyw, which translates to Old Menevia near Aberaeron, is the site of an ancient monastery. The site overlooks Cardigan Bay, and according to tradition, this is where the young Saint David was raised. We also find a spring here known as Llanddewi, St David's Well. The monastery was a very simple place made of wood, with walls made of sticks plastered with mud. A roof of straw or rushes kept out the rain. Around the monastery were other simple buildings where the monks ate, studied and slept. In one of these buildings, young David sat and listened to the wise words of his tutor, Paulinus. Paulinus was a wise, good and holy man. He loved to listen while the monks sang prayers, but he was old and his sight was growing faint. He felt sad as he peered at the Bible. He could barely make out the letters. How could he teach his pupils if he could no longer see to read? And in those days, there was little light to help you see, just a few rushlights or candles, and glasses were a long way off being invented. As the days passed, Paulinus found it harder and harder to see anything at all. Now, even on the sunniest days, he had to feel his way along, using his hands to guide him. He would touch the walls to find his way around the buildings, with the monks helping him to his seat in front of his class. David sat in front of the elderly monk, listening to him struggle to read the words in the great Bible in front of him. If only I could help him see clearly again, he thought, but what could he do? Paulinus would look at the young monk and smile. He already knew that David was a special person. And then early one morning, Paulinus woke and found that he could see nothing at all. He was entirely blind. He fell to his knees by his bed and prayed, God, hear my prayer. Restore my sight so that I may continue to serve you and do your work. I have guided many young monks. May they now help me. Let your Holy Spirit enter them so that the touch of their hands on my eyes will restore my sight. That morning, as the young monks filed into the room, Paulinus told them what had happened. How sad the monks were when they heard what he said. I pray that by touching my eyelids, one of you will be able to restore my sight, Paulinus said. So one by one, the monks came forward and gently laid their fingers on their beloved teacher's closed eyes. But each time when he opened his eyes, they saw that he could still not see. At last, it was David's turn. Shyly, he came forward, making the sign of the cross as he touched his tutor's eyelids. Paulinus could not see the young monk, but he knew that it was David who now stood before him. Gently, David took his hands away from his teacher's face, and slowly Paulinus opened his eyes. A joyful smile spread across his face, and he realized that he could see. Paulinus thanked God for sending him the young monk. Soon after this miracle, an angel visited Paulinus, telling him that it was time for David to leave. He had learnt much at the monastery, but now it was time for him to go out into the world and preach to others, doing God's work. He became a missionary, travelling across the islands of Britain and Ireland. David was a fine preacher. Many people were interested in what he had to say and also wanted to live like him. He also went further afield, making a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where he would be consecrated as an archbishop. Saint David returned with a portable altar, a bell, a staff and a coat, gifts which, according to Rugavach, worked great miracles. Rugavach tells us that David founded 12 monasteries to the praise of God, first arriving at Glastonbury. It is thought that Saint David must have come to Glastonbury around the year 530 to rededicate the old church here. However, the night before the rededication of the old church, Saint David experienced a vision in which God confirmed that he himself had dedicated the old church long ago. At this point, he set about building another chapel, a sort of chancel to the east of the old church. This was on the site of the present Galilee Chapel, which you can see here, and he consecrated it before he left. Saint David is said to have received a wonderful altar stone, the sapphire from the Patriarch of Jerusalem, which he took to Wales. But then he gifted it to the community of Glastonbury, and it was incorporated into a super altar. From here, he is said to have moved to Bath, where performing another of his miracles, he cleansed deadly water and then transformed it into a warm and healing pool, allowing people to bathe in it. As David moved around, he carried with him a two-headed altar. He moved through Croyland and Repton, then to Culver and Glascombe. After that, he founded the monastery of Lempster, built a church in Raglan, and then he founded a monastery in a place which is called Llangyfelach in the Gower. Travel by sea and water meant that St David was widely known and recognised in places such as Cornwall, Normandy and Brittany. Place names, for example, Saint-Divy or Saint-Divy in Breton, and medieval churches dedicated to St David and St Non can still be identified there. St Non is actually buried in a church bearing her name in Dirinon, and a feast day celebrating her is held on the 3rd of March every year. She also has a church dedicated to her in Alternon in Cornwall. During his life, the patron saint of Wales was quite the miracle maker. St David managed to bring a child back to life by splashing the boy's face with tears. As neighbours were struggling with dried up land, David struck his staff into the ground and immediately a spring sprang forth in the spot. Some of St David's monks turned against him and decided to poison his food. A friend in Ireland foresaw this in a dream, and he sent St Scuddin to warn St David. Scuddinus was excited about the journey. A ship would not be fast enough and none were available, so whilst waiting, he let the water lap around his feet. Suddenly, from the depths of the sea, there appeared a beautiful sea creature. Its glittering scales glistened in the sun. Scuddinus clung onto its neck and sailed on its back towards the shores of Wales. When St David was warned about the deadly poison in his food, he broke his bread into 3 pieces. He gave 1 piece to a dog and another to a crow, and both died instantly. He then blessed the 3rd piece, which he ate himself without dying. On another day, one of David's disciples, named Aidan, was reading the gospel to confirm his faith. David asked Aidan to take 2 oxen and fetch some timber from a wood in a local valley. Aidan obeyed this request immediately, without thinking to close his book. Off he went, and when the timber was ready, he took the road back. The road became very steep, and the oxen, along with the wagon that they were pulling, were hurled into the sea. However, as they fell, Aidan made the sign of the cross, and the oxen returned safe and sound from the waves. Aidan was very joyful and went on his way. On his journey, Aidan now experienced a great deluge of rain, so that the ditches flowed in torrents. After Aidan's journey ended and he had returned the oxen from their work, he went to where he had left the open book. Then, as is still the case today, books were very valuable, and Aidan was worried about the book he had left. Amazingly, he found it unharmed by the rain. The grace of David had saved the book on this occasion, although it cannot be guaranteed that David will perform miracles on all books left out in the rain. Rugavach tells us that David encountered resistance from a druid and chieftain called Boya, who, threatened by David's power and renown, gathered together troops to kill David and his followers. The would-be assailants were struck down by a sudden fever, and when they returned to their estates, they found that all their cattle had mysteriously died. Now convinced of David's holy credentials, they begged forgiveness, and David restored the animals to life. However, it is perhaps St. David's most famous miracle that leads us to our next location, Llanddewi Brefi. Around 550 AD, the Synod of Brefi was held near the site of the Roman fort of Bremia. This gathering of the clergy of the Welsh Church was called to discuss Pelagian heresy. A bard named Gwynfydd Brycheiniog described the Synod as "the man I praise is one of true glory. He never was guilty of any evil deed or act of passion." He assembled the saints in his synod, the saints of Anjou and Amorica, an overflowing multitude, the saints of England and Uias, and the saints of the north, the saints of Man, of musical genius, and the Isles, the saints on Powys, a wonderful people, the saints of Ireland and Anglesey and Gwynedd, the saints of Devonshire and Kent, the saints of Brycheiniog, the country of heroism, and the saints of Meilynydd, an improved region, the saints of Wamilion, part of Herefordshire. They all came together in one convention unto Brefi to David, of good life, to receive, O David, thy brotherly consolation. The synod debate was so raucous that David could not make himself heard or seen above the din of the extremely large crowd. As told to do so, he placed a cloth on the ground underneath his feet, and the earth rose to form a mound, as can be seen here. He could now be seen and heard by all the assembled churchmen, as his voice was said to be as clear as a trumpet. It is also said that a dove representing the Holy Spirit flew down to rest on his shoulder. It was this Spirit speaking to him that gave him the inspiration for his sermons and prayers direct from God. The mound raised by St. David is said to be the one on which the church here was built. This prompted the synod to choose him as the new archbishop, although Dewi was reluctant. It is since this synod that the place has borne its current name, referring to David, Llanddewi Brefi, Llan meaning church or holy place. Gwynfydd Brycheiniog says that David had a pair of noted oxen called Oxen, that these put their necks under the car of Cynnog and drew it loaded with 3 sacred bells, running all the way as far as Glastonbury, one of which bells, styled Bangi, was left for the use of that church, and the other 2 were presented to the town of Brecknock. These sacred oxen were said to have carried all of the stones that were required for the erection of the church here at Brefi. And as proof of their existence and connection with the place, a large horn said to have belonged to one of them was shown under the name of Matcon Erechbanog, the inner horn of the buffalo. David now knew he had to return to Pembrokeshire because his guardian angel had told him that this is where he should settle and build a monastery. leads us back to where we started. So it is here David settled. Monastery life was very strict. The brothers had to work very hard cultivating land and pulling the plough. They did this by hand rather than using oxen. Many crafts were followed. Beekeeping in particular was very important, and it provides a different miracle story connected to and represented by the 3 beehives which you see behind me. An Irish monk called Madomnoch, or more commonly known as Aidan, was the beekeeper in David's monastery, making honey and wax. The sweet honey was used by the people in the community and visitors to the monastery. There came a time, however, when Aidan was ready to leave the monastery. He wanted to travel to Ireland and tell the people there more about God. As he was boarding the ship for the journey to Ireland, the bees which he had so carefully cared for followed him and settled where he sat. He knew that the bees were important to the monks and so returned to David with the bees following him. Once at the monastery, the bees settled back in their hives. Aidan then said goodbye to David and the monks again, then returned to the ship. Once again, the bees followed him, so he returned to the monastery. Returning to the ship for a 3rd time, he heard a low drone and realised his friends were back once more. Aidan walked back to the monastery, this time hoping that the bees would be tired and stay in their hives. When David saw Aidan return with the bees, he realised how kind he was to spend time returning them to the monastery. He knew that Aidan and the bees had a special relationship, and so he let him take the bees with him, reputedly introducing honeybees to Ireland. Celtic Christianity had a close relationship with the natural world, but it was sometimes a harsh one. The monks had to keep themselves fed as well as provide food and lodgings for travellers. They also looked after the poor. There are reports that the monks drank mead, which they would have made with the honey produced in St Davids. This was not true for David, however, who was a waterman or dyfrwr. That is someone who drank only water, and the more common barley beer was banned. David and the other monks were also vegetarian and ate 1 meal a day of bread and herbs or vegetables. Saint David died on the 1st of March 589 AD at Mynevia, and it is on this day every year we celebrate Dydd Gŵyl Dewi, or St David's Day. On this day, children wear traditional costume and Eisteddfodau are held. The Eisteddfod is a cultural festival with ranked competitions in music and poetry. There are competitions in dance as well. St David was buried in his original church, and his tomb became and still is a great place of pilgrimage. Even the Norman kings William the Conqueror and Henry II visited it to pay homage. These visits were mentioned in the authoritative medieval Welsh annals Brut y Tywysogion, using the word pererindod, which in both the 12th century Welsh and the Welsh of today means pilgrimage. Bishop Peter de Leia, who was a Norman monk, appointed by Henry II, rebuilt the cathedral church largely from offerings at the shrine, and the relics were moved to their present position to the north side of the presbytery in 1275. After his death, his influence spread far and wide. David was now recognised as a saint, and he was declared patron saint of Wales. Such was David's influence that many pilgrimages were made to St David's, and in 1123, Pope Calixtus II decreed that 2 pilgrimages made to St David's equalled 1 to Rome, while 3 were worth 1 to Jerusalem. On the 25th of July 2023, the day of St James, the patron saint of pilgrims, there was a big service in St David's Cathedral to mark the 900th anniversary of this event. This was one of the rare days when the very special St David's altar covering was used in the cathedral. It is also used every St David's Day. 50 churches in South Wales bear the name of St David, and every day in the cathedral they pray to one of his churches around the world. There are more than 365, so it takes more than a year to pray to them all. David's original church, made of wood and stone huts, built in the 6th century, was burned down by Viking raiders in 645 AD. The building that replaced it was sacked or destroyed many times over between 645 and 1097. It was then that Peter de Leer started construction of the stone building that you can see today in 1181. It is believed that the location of the original church was in the part of the building where the Thomas Becket Chapel and Cathedral Library are now. It is then thought that the Normans built their greater church right next to it, with this arch where the treasury stands today possibly connecting the two. St David's Cathedral is built on marshy ground and was unstable for many years until restoration work in the 19th century, so it is quite stable and safe today. It has 2 Latin names and both give you the clue. Vallis Rosina means the Valley of the Swamp. In Welsh, Glyn Rosyn, Rose Valley. Meanwhile, Menevia, the name of the wider diocese, means a thicket or brushwood. St David's Welsh name, Tyddewi, means David's house, and the city of St David's was regarded as an important place of learning during the medieval period and the ecclesiastical centre of the Welsh Church. The original shrine would have been painted to make it highly decorative, as would have much of the cathedral before the Reformation of Henry VIII, when this was cleaned off. However, in some parts of the cathedral, small parts of these paintings can still be seen. During the Reformation, many shrines were destroyed, but the shrine of St David was not completely obliterated, perhaps due to the fact that the bones of Henry Tudor were moved to the cathedral from Greyfriars Priory in Carmarthen when that was destroyed. His remains were placed in Pride of Place, where the shrine had originally been, and the shrine was moved to one side, so that it could be said to the Welsh people that the king had saved the shrine. During this period, pilgrimages were banned. Much of the cathedral was damaged, along with a large portion of the shrine. In fact, you can see the shrine in this image before it was restored. The arches around the shrine were blocked up, and the eastern part of the cathedral was left to ruin during the Civil War, where the Commonwealth troops were ordered to strip the cathedral of its lead, leaving it without a roof. During the Civil War, cathedral choral singing was also banned. Today in the cathedral is the restored shrine to St David. 11 wood carvings at the top of the canopy, directly above the part of the shrine, meant to represent the heavens, relate to different aspects of the lives of the saints depicted in the icons beneath them. The central carving of a scallop shell, also known as the pilgrim's shell, is an ancient symbol of pilgrimage and baptism used by the pilgrims on their journeys to centres of pilgrimage such as St David's. These are the shells the pilgrims would have used on their travels. The lines on the shell represent the multiple journeys from across the world meeting in one holy place of pilgrimage. The shells also provided a useful drinking vessel for the holy and healing waters at each well. Iechyd da, your good health. The first view of the shrine the pilgrims would have seen would have been through this small window in the wall niche, which is interesting as it has features of a Celtic circle and Latin cross. This was originally on an outside wall, and the shrine would have been central to it at this time. You can now find it in the Holy Trinity Chapel, which was built by Bishop Vaughan in 1509. It infilled what would have been an open space. We also see the icons of the saints who were connected with the local area of St David's were put back in place. We have St David's himself, St Patrick, St Andrew, and on the other side, St Non and St Justinian. There are offertory niches where prayers are still put to this day, and other offerings here could include money. At the bottom of the shrine are 3 niches that would have originally been for kneeling at, and are now reputed to contain the remains of Saint David and Saint Justinian, and a replica of David's Celtic bangy bell from Llanddewi Brefi. However, the niches at the back of the shrine, underneath the icons of Saint Non and Saint Justinian, can still be knelt down at, just as many pilgrims and other visitors would have, and placed their heads within to pray to David's God and ours. They have the most wonderful acoustic, as can be heard here.
Dawi and Ninnau, cadwa di ai gariad. Dawi and Ninnau, adfywaith NID. Dawi's God and ours enfold you in his love. Dawi's God and ours refresh your heart and soul.
We all know the Welsh flag with its imposing dragon, but there is a second unofficial Welsh flag. That is the flag of St David, which has a yellow cross on a black background, although it has appeared in reverse. It takes its colours from the coat of arms of the Diocese of St Davids, and we start to hear about its use as a flag at the start of the 20th century. This bears similarities with the flags of other saints, such as the flag of St Piran in Cornwall and also the Croix d'U from Brittany. It is also thanks in part to David that we have the leek as a national emblem of Wales, as it is said that he told Welsh soldiers who were fighting against the Saxons to wear leeks in their hats so that they could easily identify each other. David's last words sum up his message to all of those from the islands of Britain and Ireland who had come to join him at the end. And they also show us the gift he had for conveying the word of God. Be joyful, keep the faith, and do the little things that you have heard and seen me do. The phrase, gwnewch y pethau bychain mewn bywyd, do the little things in life, is a still well-known adage in Wales.